usually find him at Westwood Lutheran Church, where he is cantor for music, worship, and the arts. Parents among us may have seen him at Orchestra Hall, where he is the principal host for the Minnesota Orchestra's Young People concerts. You might find him teaching graduate choral conducting at St. Thomas, or you could find him anywhere around the world working with choirs. We're fortunate to have him with us this morning to talk about African American music, which has enriched our country for hundreds of years, but too often without acknowledgement or compensation for composers and artists. Philip, with thanks, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Well, good morning to you all, and thanks again, Jackie, for the invitation, and not only that, for the patience and stick-to-itiveness in finding a date that we can make this work, because indeed, every Sunday morning I'm at Westwood. In fact, our service started 5 minutes ago. So on Sundays we have one service in the summertime. So I had to make sure it was a Sunday that I had another musician leading things, and so this works out well. It's also nice to be here at Plymouth in a different capacity, spending most of my time here leading the ensembles, working side by side with Philip Brunel, but to speak to this, which came to me, I think, because it's a conversation that you were beginning to have here as a congregation, particularly around this idea of reparations as it relates to Black musical traditions. And so our thought today is to give some context. I have nothing scripted here. I'm going to just speak to you in a sequential manner here, and anytime you have a question, you want to go deeper on something, we can do that, and if we don't get to everything, we'll just have to figure out another time to continue the conversation. Because there is no way in 40, 45 minutes that we can really get to the heart of this matter. But we can lift up a few observations and some things that we can be thinking about. Intentionality is going to be the concept that I come back to over and over. Why is it that we want to have this discussion, A, and then what is our goal? What is the purpose behind any action that is taken? Because I'll state, and I'm pretty bold, some of you know me, Jeff knows me better than most because he's been on the board and in a lot of conversations around race and equity and justice with me, so I can be a straight shooter at times. I'm from Georgia, not from Minnesota. So I don't mean to offend you when I go to the core, but I'll say too many times we want to do things because it makes us feel better about ourselves and about our institution. And I am someone who is working in a church currently, and most of churches that I've worked in since 1998 are churches that are, largely populated by people of Eurocentric background. Now, right off the bat, we can't say a white church because I don't know what a white church is. That's just a foreign concept to me. Because by saying a white church means it's a white God, a white Jesus, which means that I don't have a place and other people don't have a place in that. And that's not our view of the gospel, right? That's not our view of our Christian tradition here. So these words that trip us up sometimes, white church, black church, they're used to separate us and divide us. So I want to stick with the term of, a church kind of in that Eurocentric mainstream, if you will, that Eurocentric theology, if you will, that's populated by people from that background. Oftentimes, we struggle with, our relationship to things that are close to us, but that are uncomfortable to us. And so when we talk about the Negro spiritual, and Felix, you let me know, am I still coming through okay up there on the stream when I move over here? Great. I thought we'd have a little board here just in case, write some key words every now and then, so if you want to come back to something, you've got a word there. I think the first thing we have to get into is, what is the Negro spiritual? And why is it that I use the term Negro? Okay, I'm left-handed. I should have put the board on the other side. I just realized there. I'll come this way like this. It'll be easier for me to write. Yeah, I think I would know I'm in the middle of teaching my classes right now, or at St. Thomas, but that was a rookie mistake there. So the spiritual, the Negro spiritual, is among the first bodies of musical art form, if you will, created here on this soil after it's become known as America. Now, the interesting thing to that is the people who created it at that time were not considered Americans, right? They didn't see themselves as Americans, nor were they seen as Americans. In fact, they weren't even seen as human beings. right? They were treated almost as livestock, right? They were treated as not just property, as a commodity, a source of economic exchange. And so for me, it's very important that this descriptor stays in front, because we're reclaiming this word and taking it from the pejorative that it was to give it power now. When we say African American spiritual, that's not wrong necessarily, but it's assuming that they were American and seen as American at that time, and they were not. And that's a way of softening the history. So the first thing for me is we have to go back to this, and as those of you who come from this Eurocentric background who have less melanin in your skin, most of you in the room, okay, you have to be comfortable in saying the term Negro spiritual. I find my colleagues don't want to say it. It's like, well, I can't say Negro. Negro spiritual, you can say. Don't call me a Negro, that's outdated. I'll look at you, okay? My father can get away with that, right? In his way, we have a relationship. But as it relates to this particular genre, this body of creation, I expect that personally. You talk to another scholar, another person in my background, they may have a slightly different interpretation of it, and that's okay, and I respect that. But from my standpoint, I think this gives it power, and it's true to what the creation is. So we can call them songs or forms of sonic expression, right? The idea was the spiritual was this expression of a group of people whose minds were free, their souls were liberated, but their bodies were captured. So they were enslaved beings. They were not slaves, but they were enslaved persons there. And these songs gave them an opportunity to express, utter, proclaim not only where they are now, but where they could see themselves going. So it was a sense of past, present, and also future in these spirituals. Not all of them are religious in the way that we think of, religion and faith. Most of them have Old Testament topics, and there's something in common with them. So I'm going to tell the story of about a few of them there, and let's see if we can figure out what's the thing in common that these enslaved beings, these West African bodies that were brought here, these persons heard in these stories that were taught to them in this new faith that they were forced to kind of adopt, right? So you have Joshua fighting the battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? What about Jonah in the belly of the whale? What about Moses? When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Go down, Moses. What do you hear so far in all three of those? There's a struggle. Liberation. And that's the key. Absolutely, there's a struggle. There's a conflict. There's something they're dealing with. But there's also this sense of we can get to the other side of this. And I don't know how they did it. And again, I'm only a product of my time, this mid-70s until now, dating myself a little bit there, right? There's no way that I would have had the resiliency that they had to, in the midst of all they were facing, to sing these songs and to see so much hope for the people that were coming after them. It just baffles me all the time. But that's what it was. This was a form of liberation. And I love that, the enslavers, the ones who were thinking, okay, we've taught them these stories now, they're going to be good, they're going to be passive, they're going to do what we want. And they're out here singing, these songs. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? And Daniel delivered Daniel. And they are talking about, hey, when the time is right, we're going to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves, to work towards freedom. Run into freedom, going home. Run into freedom, going home. Run into freedom, going home. Run, sister, run, run, run. Okay? Wading in the water. All of these topics. You know many of these songs, right? Deep River, my home is over Jordan there. All of them have this liberation aspect to them. They also had a coded aspect to them, right? And some of you have heard the stories about the code language. and that it was a sense of timing, and that oftentimes certain songs were sung when it was time to begin to make the trip away. It's time now to leave, okay? Let's do our best to move towards freedom there. So I find it fascinating. I learned the spirituals in the black church. My home church is 4th Street Missionary Baptist Church, Columbus, Georgia. The time it was Reverend J.H. Flakes Jr. was the pastor. Now the Reverend J.H. Flakes III is the pastor. They call him Johnny. And, yeah, black missionary Baptist churches are kind of like that sometimes. That's another conversation for another day. But this idea of, we sang these songs, and that's how I first learned them in the context of, our religious services. This was not necessarily the original intention of these songs, though, to be sung in a service as we think of it. They were part worship, I do believe that, but worship happened in a different way, right? Worship could happen while you're in between your assignments there. Worship could happen while you're in the fields. You've heard some of the spirituals are actually work songs, okay? Some of the songs that we've taken out of our concert literature because we know they're not appropriate now. Gonna jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton. Gonna jump down, turn around, pick a bale a day. Oh, Lordy, pick a bale of cotton. Okay? I don't need to have a choir singing that song in a concert setting without the context of it. But this was a song that was sung while they were out picking cotton. I mean, it got them through the day there. So some of these songs, again, spiritual in the sense of religious connection, faith tradition. Others were work songs that got them through the day and that kind of helped them stay connected to each other and passing time away there. So this term, Negro spiritual, this is the body of music that we do not know who the authors are. They were passed down by oral tradition. And that's a very important point. Because in most, and this is a paradoxical point too, one of the things that I love, in most of our musical traditions and what we celebrate, and this church is one of them, some great music here, right? Wonderful things happening here. It's all about the complexity of the score and the ability to read music. I mean, that's Philip's main thing is how fast can you sight read? How well can you sight read? We can go through hundreds of pieces in a year, right? And I'm cool, I'm with them too. I'm like, yes, we must sight read, and that's an important skill. But to learn the Negro spiritual, there was nothing to sight read. There was nothing to read. You picked it up. I start singing, and you start singing with me, and you might take a little bit here, and I might take a little bit there, but we're going to meet on the end. And the next time we do it, it's going to be a little bit different. And the next time we do it, it's going to be a little bit different. And so that's the beautiful thing about the spiritual. We have so many arrangements of them now that you're probably aware of, and I'm curious if you know of the names of some arrangers of spirituals, so I'll give you a second to mull that over and see if some come to mind for you. But we really can't get back to like with 100% certainty to the actual tune when it was first created. So when people use the word authenticity, slow down sometimes there. I call BS. Sunday morning, so I'm not going to say the full thing. Okay? But, I call BS because we don't know what really is authentic. Like, there's no way to know unless we were to go to the primary sources. And maybe when we get to heaven, we can get the answer. But we got to find a way to send it back down here. You with me? So I think we have to be careful. This is one of the things that people care about now. We have to do the authentic spiritual. That's what we're going to do in an authentic manner. I'm like, no. But is it connected to the intentionality, and the purpose behind it? And I want to come back to that in a second to take us to the next spot. So when you think of spirituals, because I'm sure many of you have heard, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Or perhaps you've heard, especially here at this church, in the Lord, my soul's been anchored. In the Lord, my soul's been anchored. My soul's been anchored in the Lord, in the Lord, in the Lord. My soul's been anchored in the Lord. Okay, those are a couple of arrangements of spirituals there. Does anyone know of a spiritual arranger? James Cleveland. That's a great name to mention. I'm glad you did, because I'm going to put him up here in a different color. Not a great color. Because that points out something different in the moment that I want to get to. I'm glad you said his name. We'll come back to James. Moses Hogan. That is correct. And that was the one I just did there. Moses Hogan. In the late 90s, in particular, the mid-90s to late 90s before his untimely death, he is credited with creating the most recent versions of the spirituals that brought them to the concert stage, bringing the best of the Western European tradition with the spiritual tradition, creating these complex pieces. Like they are really virtuosic and challenging to sing his spirituals correctly. Yeah.
Did somebody like Oscar Peterson ever do anything like this?
Oscar didn't do much with spirituals. I'm going to put his name over here too with James Cleveland, because it's a different genre that we sometimes connect to the spiritual. And that's what I want to come back to here in just a moment.
Did Thomas Dorsey do it?
Thomas was also more on this side. I love that you all are calling these names though, because these are important names in the conversation. Alice did actually arrange a few spirituals. For those of you that don't know, I'll say it out loud. So Moses, we would say African diaspora. Alice, not the African diaspora. Okay.
Melanie DeMore, did she arrange, or I know she did a lot of original.
Mm-hmm. Melanie would be considered a modern arranger of spirituals, and the way she does it, in her tradition, there's no sheet music again. So when she incorporates spirituals in her songs, that would be considered arrangement.
More than just singing.
More than just singing. It's creating, you're taking a melody and then adding layers to it there. If you know anything about Morehouse, we've had Morehouse here many times. One of their big main directors, Wendell Whalum. Anybody ever heard of that name, Wendell Whalum? Okay. Anybody ever heard of the name? Write Wendell's name up here. Let's see. If I say Tuskegee Institute, anybody know who was there? He was a big arranger of spirituals. William Dawson. So William Dawson is kind of the one who, I would call him the precursor to Moses Hogan. In his time period, he was the first one to really make the spirituals virtuosic. When you think of Antonin Dvorak, who is he known for having a relationship with? There's a black musician that Dvorak learned the spiritual tradition from, so much so that the second movement of his New World Symphony, da 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 ba ba bum, ba 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 ba, which was later taken by one of his students to the song that's sung at funerals, going home, sounds like a spiritual, but isn't one. But Dvorak learned the spirituals from Harry Burleigh. Have I heard that name? Oh gosh, take out your pencils or your phones. Okay? I want you to write these names down, because if you're having this conversation about the spiritual, here at the church and reparations and things like that, you really need to know the name Harry Burleigh first and foremost. What Burleigh did was, he was the first one to really put this into a collection of solos. So there's 2 volumes of solos in the Negro spirituals that are beautiful, that are still sung. And this was the catalyst for everything else that we've listed here, in my opinion, what Burleigh did. So if you think of when Dvorak lived, they were good friends. That time period, that's how long ago Burleigh notated these, and these were being sung in classical conservatory settings. And then the Fisk Jubilee Singers, you've heard that name, Fisk Jubilee Singers, they are credited as the first ensemble. Yes. Mm-hmm. Harry Burleigh is from the African diaspora. Canadian, he learned the spirituals from and Nathaniel Dett's another name I'll put up here too. They both learned the spirituals from their grandparents, hearing them sing it. and became fascinated and wanted to blend their musical training with their history. So we owe a debt of gratitude to both of these guys for really putting them on paper. Fisk Jubilee Singers are considered the first ensemble to start touring with spirituals. And this is a historically black college university out of Tennessee there. So coming over here with James Cleveland, I'm glad, like I said, someone mentioned James Cleveland there. That happens all the time on Tuesday nights too, when we're in rehearsals. So let's see if it's gonna just pop up if I need to. Do I need to push the button again to get the screen to come back on, Felix, or is it still there? Is it just resting? I'll push the power button again just in case. Yeah. I'm going to play you a little James Cleveland. Yeah, it There we go. Let's try that again.
I've come too far from where I started from. Listen, this is what she said. Nobody told me that the road would be. I don't believe he brought me this far to leave.
Every time I hear that song, that takes me way back. What do you hear in that recording? I want you to be like basic level. Okay? Where do you hear rhythm, or how do you hear the rhythm being created? What's producing the rhythm? What am I doing? What have I got here? Drum set. Thank you. Okay? There's a drum set. What else do you hear? Organ. Organ. A Hammond organ. Not just any organ. Not that beautiful instrument. A Hammond. Those things can sing. It's the art form that makes those things sing. It's something to behold. Yep, you probably heard a bass guitar and a piano. Instruments, right? So the spirituals, in their original form, would not have had instruments other than perhaps some body percussion and maybe something taken around the plantation to create rhythm. You know, they're a cappella. They're a cappella and maybe a body percussion thing. Gospel music is going to have instruments to it. It can be a cappella too, but at its core, gospel music is going to have instruments to it. And gospel music followed the spiritual. This is one of my favorite things to kind of just diagram, and I'm not going to do the whole tree, but if we start here with the spiritual as the foundation here, if you will, we can move up in time. We've got gospel music. That one also sounded like, you know, could that have made it if you changed the words? And maybe if you were singing, said, I don't feel no ways tired. Or if you were singing, I want you to be my wife. You look so good tonight. What does it kind of have quality-wise? What do you hear in there? Little what? Blues. Little blues. Okay? So gospel kind of has these origins, if you will, of blues. And I'm just going to put them on the same line. Blues and jazz, you know, influence in there. But they all come from this lineage. Now, we keep on going up. We can get to rhythm and blues, since we said blues there, rhythm and blues, R&B. We can keep on going up. We can get to hip hop. Okay? Keep on going up. get the straight up, rap, okay? But then we come out here, and over here, we can get country. Okay? Out here, we can get rock and roll. Right? You starting to see where I'm going? You name me a genre of music that has happened in our lifetime, and I can keep adding it up on the tree as one of the branches here, the limbs, coming from the spiritual. Yes?
What was the Western African musical heritage that began on, I assume began on?
Yeah, well, so the question was about the Western African musical heritage that began a lot of this. So many of the spirituals are rooted in the Western African traditions, and there's a lot of polyrhythmic music's happening there. And what I mean by that is, let's say everyone out there, I want you to clap your hands in a pattern of 4. So I want you all to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Everybody do that. You keep going. Aren't you glad I didn't give you the second part? Okay, but the idea of having multiple layers of rhythm going, because a lot of the West African traditions and in the language is still true today in a lot of cultures around the world. Dance and music are the same word, or a similar word, or a related word. They're not separate entities. So music and dance and movement and rhythm are all one element, if you will. And so a lot of the Western African rhythmic influences and melodic influences that have this polyrhythmic drive to them are what we find in the spiritual. And again, when I come back when we talk another time about it, there are actually many, let's say, lineages of the spiritual. Because if we talk about the Sea Islands, there's a whole different sound to the spirituals there on the Carolinas and the Georgia coast there, because they came from different portions of Africa. And as we know, with any large continent, to this day, if you go to different parts of Africa, you go to Tanzania, it's a very different sound than Kenya. We're gonna hear some similarities, but they each have their distinctive characteristics, right? And sometimes here in America, we, and I'm guilty of this too, right? Even as a black body, we think African music and we have the same characteristics that we want to play out. It'd be like the same thing as thinking about here in the United States, and we have a casserole and we have a hot dish. I call it casserole, even though I'm married a Minnesotan. I'm still like, oh, we're having a hot dish. Yes. Yes. Catch myself after 15 years of marriage. So there's lines of the spiritual. So I'm simplifying it, just calling it Negro spiritual right now, but there's lots of complexity there. But this is an important lineage that I'm getting into, because it leads me to one of my important points for you to consider. For all of you that identify as Americans, okay, America's your home. This is the country that, for better, for worse, that you are here, trying to make better. The Negro spiritual is part of your heritage. This is your music too. Your relationship to it is much more complex and fraught with challenges than perhaps mine. But you have to have a relationship to it to tell the full story of American culture and American music. So when people ask me, should our church sing spirituals? I'm kind of like, why are you asking me that question? Like, of course you should. You're right here. Especially if it ties to the message of the day. Why wouldn't you sing the spiritual? Now, there's certain spirituals that you might have to think long and hard about. How does this work and how are we connected to it? And that's a deeper conversation. But at its core, the body of music, the Negro spiritual, is meant to be sung and shared by all of us in this culture. It was, in a way, one scholar puts it as a gift, our gift to the world. Now, we get caught up in beauty and aesthetics in our world today. Coming back to, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. If you say to me, Philip, that is so beautiful, I will receive it with grace, but at the same time, there's a little bit of dissonance going, did you not hear what I was saying? Right? So the thing about the spiritual is the words, the intention, the meaning, the context of the words outweighs the aesthetical beauty of the line or the rhythm. That's where we get in trouble. Because for far too long with the Negro spiritual, it has been programmed as a showstopper at the end of a concert. It's a technical thing. Look at us, we can do this. And we're smiling. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, 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 and the walls came tumbling down. Right? I've seen choirs from other countries, like they're choreographing spirituals. And I can't get mad at them because it's like, who is set down to tell them the story? Like, have they had a chance to really get the history and understand that's not what that song's about? It may sound upbeat, okay, but it's really deep. We find this in South African music too. For those of you that came to the last Vocal Essence concert, the singers of this age sang a song, Aziz Zenina, and we sang it with the movements that they do. But when you look at the words, it's actually crying out, God, what have we done? AIDS. Why has AIDS taken us over? What can we do better? And it's just a fascinating dichotomy there where you have to kind of separate yourself, and knowing that cultural tradition, the way that they can sing the same song in times of joy and sorrow as a way of keeping them engaged in the conversation is something you have to understand to be able to bring it the level of intentionality and purposefulness that our siblings there would share when they're singing it. It took us a while to wrap our heads around it. The kids loved the song, and then I gave them the translation, like, what? We're singing this like this? And we had to have some long conversations around, okay, how do we grapple with this? How does this make sense? The same is true for the Negro spiritual here, especially in our churches. So reparations, with that backdrop, at its core, what are reparations?
Trying to repair a relationship.
Trying to repair a relationship. Okay? What are the ways that we can repair relationships? I love that language there. So everybody just name ways that we can repair relationships.
Apologizing.
Okay, keep going.
Recognition.
Say more about recognition.
As possible to recognize an
I'm
artist's
supposed to do this.
as possible to recognize an artist's contribution to a work of art.
Okay. So thank you for bringing it to the music side here. But I'm just talking in general, right? So the idea of giving that recognition to the appropriate person or persons. Okay, what else?
Acknowledging the mistakes of the past.
Acknowledging mistakes of the past. You say acknowledgement. Mm-hmm.
Honoring the injury.
Say that again.
Honoring the injury.
Honoring the injury. Say more what you mean by the injury.
Take the mic.
I know more now than I did then,
Okay.
and I want to honor the harm I did.
Okay. Makes sense. Yes, sure.
To change the behavior, to stop the hurtful behavior.
Okay. Change behavior. Okay. Yes.
Just to be with.
To be with.
With you.
Okay. So, in a sense, almost reconcile. Okay, I'm going to interpret that and put reconciliation. Right? Because we can work to repair without getting to that layer of reconciliation, which is to be at the table together. Right? Everybody acknowledge that? So these could be layers to this here. This is a great list. I heard money come out there too. Did someone say money? Did I make that up? Okay, I want to get into that money piece. How is money a part of repair?
I'm not saying it should be. I'm. In the current press, when you see the term reparations, it's frequently around. We're paying you some amount to repair the damage that we've done.
That makes sense. That economic sense of, because that's one of the things that's at the heart of this one, right? Is that oftentimes access to economic power and wealth, right? And stability and something for your family, that sense of lineage there, legacy is withheld. So I do think it needs to be on the list, and I'm glad it's down here as we're talking through it. Because oftentimes, and you're absolutely right, what's your name?
John.
John. Oftentimes we lead with this. We lead with the money piece. I'm not saying it's wrong. And I am having this, I'm so grateful when we got this conversation. And you all know Phillip really well, right? Most of you have been around in Plymouth for a while. So Phillip calls me in one day. I can't remember when this first conversation first came up. I think maybe he sent me an email first. He was like, can you read this and let's talk about it? And it was the article about this was being done. And then we walked in the room, he's like, so what do you think? And I was like, Phillip, I'm not sure what I think on this one here. What I can tell you is if y'all just start throwing money at something, that's not necessarily gonna make it better, because who are you throwing the money at? And so I said, but let me sit with it because it's a fascinating conversation. And I hadn't thought of it at that point in time as it relates to the Negro spiritual. I've thought of it in other contexts quite a bit, you know. So what's the most complex thing about the money side as it relates to the Negro spiritual based on the conversation we've had? There's one particular fact. Yeah, the who. Because we can't, we can tell a body of people, right? A body of people, we can probably dissect the lineage and figure out who are the, direct descendants, if you will, there. But it's not like there's Jeff Smith who wrote Sometimes I Feel Like the Motherless Child, or Tom who wrote Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? And we can go to his family and repay his family. We have to make a judgment on who we're giving money to, and then determine, okay, is that going towards really repairing the damage for the people who should benefit from it? You get where I'm coming from? It might, but I think it's fraught with all kinds of additional questions, especially from those in our congregation and communities who are really skeptical. Because part of my goal is to try to bring people into a sense of coming to the table, to be with, to have the conversation and bridge the difference and acknowledge that we may not totally agree on this, but if I can get you to come along with me and see that there's value in this, we can move forward and work through it over time. But if I just tell you we're going to give money to an organization because they have black people in them and black people were responsible for creating spirituals, I think you're going to lose a few people along the way. Right, Tom?
So the issue is at least the part, who gets to decide where the money goes?
Yep, who gets it and who gets to decide.
As the giver, we say it's our money, we'll choose where to put it. That's missing the reconciliation. That's half of what we need to do.
Exactly. It may not even be repair at that point. It goes back to what I said earlier of, does that make you feel good to be able to give some money off and said, okay, Philip Burnell programmed the spiritual today, so I'm going to give $5 to, the United Negro College Fund.
It's the notion of guilt also.
It all is rooted in guilt. And that sense of guilt is something that I think all of us struggle with. For many of us, guilt was a large part of our theological underpinning. I mean, how many of you grew up in a tradition where guilt was always on your mind? I know I did. It may not be now. I'm not saying now, but maybe at the time, I always was feeling guilty for something. And most of it was self-imposed or just the interpretation of thou shalt not. We're doing a series right now at our church. It's about the 10 Commandments, a fresh look at them and and again, we're Lutheran, so we have a Luther spin on it. But the idea was more than being what not to do, it's a sense of boundaries for us to live in community. is what the intention was, right? And a mirror for, that was my timing, so I would just know when we're getting close. A mirror for us to look at ourselves and to see if we are, at peace with where we are. So I appreciate you saying the guilt, because if you lead with guilt rather than leading with love, to borrow Melanie the Moore phrase, and the pledge that I created that some of you saw, I think you used it here. If you lead here, I just think the intentions are wrong and it's not going to do any good. If we instead lead with love and we really seek to repair, a lot of these things here that you've talked about can be coupled with money. If you really do want to put some economic power behind this, not saying it's wrong, but wouldn't it make sense every time a spiritual is programmed to have something in there to help people understand the context of that particular spiritual? And maybe to give them something to go to where they can do their own research or something to listen to. Little nugget. There's one church in Connecticut, and I can give you the name of it later, I can't remember off the top of my head, where they created a little pledge that the congregation says each time they program a spiritual. That was their way of getting to this. And then they were also working out who they were giving money to, and they actually had an organization in their city that their whole purpose was to preserve the Negro spiritual. And so they developed a relationship. They had conversations with this particular institution and developed the relationship and determined how then they would be able to create a sense of pipeline of funding. Because whenever we program most of our hymns and contemporary songs, which I know there aren't many contemporary worship songs here, mostly the hymns and the hymnal, right? But at the 9 a.m. service, there may be some. There's something called CCLI. And our CCLI license allows us to sing all of those songs, and we pay a quarterly fee as a church. And then the job of the CCLI people, the licensing people, is to divvy up those royalties to the people who've written them. So there's a process for doing this for every other body of music. When you buy a hymnal, all of those hymns in the hymnal, that's already been done. Now, many of them are public domain because they've been around for so long, but that process is done, so someone has gotten royalties or is getting royalties for all of those things in that book, right? That's done there. Now, there are a few spirituals in the book, and so you always go back to, I wonder who gets those royalties. It's probably the arranger, which, I'm okay with, especially if it's someone from the African diaspora. If it's some random person who just arranged a spiritual and put in the hymnal, maybe it's a little conflicting there, but that's the system that we have. Most of the music has a place to go. The spirituals is the only thing that doesn't have a place to go to. Gospel music's also complex, again, because it's not being written down, and I can listen to that recording, I don't feel no ways tired, and go to the piano and play it. And I can teach a choir that arrangement without using anything, right? I can just teach it to them by ear again, and it's the same question there too. At least we know, okay, that was James Cleveland, so I can find out who he got his licensing to, and if I really feel compelled, I can pay them. But the similar thing happens. In the black church and in churches of culture around the world, this conversation is starting to come up now. When I've spent time in Mexico, there was a lot of just copying of music because they didn't see the value of it. It's shared in their mind of, hey, you created this for us to use. So it's a shared thing. It's a different view lens of communal, right? So some of our guilt is connected to our interpretation of how we live in community. When Jim creates something, it's Jim's, and he owns it. Whereas in other communities, when, let's see if I call another name here. Rick creates something, I don't feel like I'm picking on one person. When Rick creates something, if you're in many African communities, you don't own it. You've created something for us all to be a part of and to share. And so ownership doesn't matter. Yeah, so that's another layer of complexity to it that's interesting, that I don't think we'll ever get to in our lifetime here in our culture, because we're very much guarded by the boundaries of ownership. My challenge to you as we begin to end our time together is to work on this list first of, if you really care about this topic and how can we repair and reconcile, what are the ways and things that you can do? And then who are the people that you can be in relationship with here? Is it locally? Is it regionally? Is it globally, that connect back to this tradition in some way or another? And then start to look at what makes the most sense to create relationship, to provide more context and understanding, and then eventually, if there is this desire to put money behind it, figuring out what's the best way to do that. And that's like I said, it's a deeper conversation. It has to be a second conversation for us to really get into that a little further. I hope this has been illuminating at least and open up some thoughts for you. And I'm sorry to have to cut it, but I know the organ's going to start in a moment here.
Philip, thank you.
Absolutely. Welcome.
We really are indebted to you for this history and context and your wisdom. Thank you. I hope you'll come back 1 month from today. Our last Sunday forum for the summer is the second Sunday in August, when Kurt Hunter and his wife Kathy will introduce us to their world of marionettes. Kurt has been refining his art since he became hooked on puppetry as a teenager, and he's recently directed with In the Heart of the Beast Puppet Mask Theater, taught at Eugene O'Neill Theater Center in Connecticut, and has performed, he and Kathy, at puppetry festivals in India. So please join us on August 11th for the last forum of the summer. Thank you so much for coming, and again, thank you, Phillip.